And we're recording.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Elizardi. I'm the Director for Alumni Engagement with the University of Denver, and I am excited to host our webinar today. We've got a great agenda planned for you, and today we're going to be talking about effective communication in the 21st century. And one of the things that we all know is that we need a network for success. But did you know that only 7% of the way a message is received is based on the actual words you use? So with us today is Shelley Hamill. She's president of Sage Alliance. Shelley is a sought-after speaker for companies and associations, organizations, and she regularly speaks on important topics such as personal branding, influential leadership, effective communication, creating a coaching culture, and other key leadership success factors. And we're delighted to have Shelley join us today. Some of the things we'll cover today are learning how to leverage your social connections with these excellent communication techniques. We'll go over how to make sure that your voice is heard, and Shelley will also discuss with us how to make great first impressions, and then how to be intentional with the way you communicate with your intended audience. So it's my pleasure to hand over the microphone to Shelley, who's obviously a leader in the industry, but is also one of our beloved Peach pioneers down in Atlanta. So Shelley, we are delighted to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate it. And I am really excited to do this. I talk about credible communications. I talk about many of the things that you named. I'm an executive coach. I do team building and all kinds of leadership. And so it's great to be able to bring that to my alma mater, University of Denver. And I'm really thrilled to be here today. So welcome, everybody. And probably everyone, you should put your phones on mute just so we don't hear lots of background noise. We are recording this, and so it's a great opportunity to listen in. But we will be using the chat feature. And so hopefully you know how to use the chat feature, but I believe it's in the drop down on the top of your screen. And I have a couple of questions I'll be asking. And so if you want to use that chat feature to answer, that would be fantastic. So we're going to get started. And today is really about credible communications, how to show up and position yourself so that when you speak, you're credible. And we're going to start this off maybe a little bit different than you would normally think. And so let me tell you what we're going to be speaking about in the next 50 minutes or so. And so what I hope for us to accomplish today is to talk about how communications impacts your presence. And I call it professional presence. But when we think about communication, we just think about what we say in speaking and getting out what we need to say. What I want us to accomplish today is how that rolls into what your professional presence is. We're going to talk about the enhancers and detractors to your presence. And I've got just some thoughts about how to take action. So I'm very action oriented. There's no reason to listen in on something if you're not going to do something with it. So we'll talk a little bit about that before we wrap up today. So this is our first opportunity, and I asked Charlotte to help me out here so that if you're able to use your chat feature and you want to kind of pipe in, I'd love for us to hear from you. But my question is, what is professional presence? And if you want to just go ahead and jot that in the chat feature, that'd be great. But what is professional presence? So I know we're talking about communication today, but I mentioned that communications and presence are really tied together. So what is professional presence? And Charlotte, if you can help us out here, that'd be great.
Sure. So some of the things to think about are someone who's poised, or maybe professional presence can mean confidence to some people. And feel free to type it in the chat feature if you have anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, we'll give you just another couple of seconds. So poised. Charlotte, anything else that's popping up that you see?
I would say competence, or
Okay.
knowledgeable, someone who's knowledgeable. Yeah.
All right, so we've got competence and confidence and knowledge. So professional presence is all of those things. And the thing to think about is professional presence is the compilation of all of these things. It's not just one behavior, it's all of the behaviors. And we're going to talk about what this really means as we continue through today's presentation. So I want to talk a little bit about first impressions. And I always ask this question, how accurate are first impressions? And answers that I tend to hear when I'm speaking on this are not very accurate, or 50% accurate, or 20%, or 30%. And so I hear all different types of answers to this. And so here's the thing that I really wanted you guys to know is that first and foremost, first impressions are formed instantaneously. They happen the moment that you meet somebody. In fact, when we meet somebody, we're scanning. We're scanning, are they a friend or are they a foe? We're looking at where do they belong? And so we immediately form first impressions. And so if you think about that, they're formed instantaneously. And how accurate are they? They're 60% accurate. That means 2/3 of the time that you're forming an impression or someone's informing an impression on you,
properties, let's speaking. How may I help you?
2/3 accurate. And so, and again, if you've got us not on mute, please go ahead and mute us so that everyone could hear. That would be fantastic. So anyway, so first impressions are so accurate, 67%. But if a first impression is something that is happening in moments, in seconds, what is it based on? And so there's this great article that was written by Amy Cuddy and in Wired magazine that said first impressions are based on 2 components. And the first is, can I trust this person? And trust is really measured by warmth. And then, can I respect this person? Will this person carry out what they say they're going to do? And so you might already be kind of getting a sense that while we're talking about first impressions, they're really about lasting impressions. And so imagine if it's 2/3 accurate, you want to make the best impression that you can, because really those first impressions really turn into lasting impressions. So let's look at what are the characteristics between trust and respect, because this really is the basis for today's conversation on effective and credible communications. So trust and competence. Let's look at trust first. So again, measured by warmth, this is the first thing we're looking at. We're scanning friend or foe. And so we're looking at, did this person smile? Are they making eye contact? Did they extend their hand, a handshake? What's their body language like? So are they closed off or are they open? What does that look like? And what's their tone of voice? Is it inviting or does it sound like, mean or too direct or something along those lines? And then the characteristics for respect. Remember, again, this is about competence. This is confidence. It's all of these things. Will this person carry out what they say they will do? So confidence, again, could be about posture. Are you standing tall? Are your shoulders back? Do you have good posture? Again, are you open? Are you looking like that you not only want to speak to somebody, but look like you're commanding the room? Then there's competence, which is knowledge. Do you know your stuff? So when you speak, does it sound like you know what you're talking about? And then going a little bit more into lasting impressions, are you prepared? Did you do your homework? Is the knowledge and the information that you're sharing, does it make sense? And then, do you have good input into conversations? And these are just some of the things that we're talking about. But I want you guys to think about, because we're really talking about this network of people in DU, the Volunteer Leadership Network. But think about all of your interactions in business, personal, wherever you are, and how you show up is really what professional presence is. And that takes me to what are the 3 elements of professional presence. It's verbal communication, it's nonverbal, and then it's this other area that I'm calling unconscious behaviors or things that can detract from your presence. So as we're talking about communications today, I'm really putting this under the guise of professional presence, because it truly is how you show up. People will make a decision if you're somebody they want to work with, they want to talk to, whether, again, you're a friend or foe. If you've got that confidence, that competence, they're going to determine if you're somebody that they want to work with. So let's look at what all of these elements are. So the first area is verbal communications. And you heard Brian talk about some of these percentages, but I'm going to give it to you so that you've got all the percentages. So when we think about communication, 7% of the way a message is received is composed of the actual words that we use. Now think about this for a minute. When you prepare to, maybe you do formal presentations, you practice, you prepare, you do research. Maybe you're working with your manager to get buy-in or to sell a concept or an idea. You do the research, you focus on the content of your presentation. But ultimately, and I'm not saying this isn't important, the content only represents 7% of the way your message is received. It's these other elements that make so much more of a difference. So 38% of the way in which we communicate is through the tone of our voice and voice inflection. And we're going to do a little demo for you. Hopefully that will kind of demonstrate that to you. But 38% is through our tone and our inflection, and a whopping 55% comes from our nonverbal communication. And so we're going to talk about that as well, and how important all of these elements are. So let's take a look first at verbal communication. And there's lots that go into this, but I want to talk a little bit about the things you see here on your screen. And so first is volume. And so when I raise my voice, that could do a lot of different things. It could be very commanding, demanding, very direct. It could show passion and energy. When I soften my volume, it could mean that you have to maybe listen in a little bit harder. It could maybe sound that I'm tentative. I'm not really sure of myself. Speed and pace is really important too. If I'm talking really fast, it might sound like I just want to get this over with, or I'm really nervous and I'm just talking. So speed and the way in which we pace our voice also makes a big difference, and the way in which people perceive us and the way in which we're most credible. Energy, I was talking about that as well. If you're passionate, I am passionate about communications and what we are talking about today, and hopefully you're hearing that energy and that passion in my voice. And so once again, we connect with these things that we hear just simply in the voice. Tone and inflection, also important, and I'm going to, in a moment, give you just a quick example of where that works. And then last but not least, pauses and punctuation. And I mention this because we don't think about how we speak, that it should be similar to how we write. So we use punctuation, periods, commas, this, and having run-on sentences and people are just trying to listen and connect with what you're saying. Instead, take a breath. Pause, give people time to process, give people time to connect, and then be careful of what I call fillers, which are ums and uhs and so's and likes, or whatever it is that you use, because that can also make you look ineffective or unsure or not as credible. And again, credibility is one of those key things that we're looking at when we're talking about professional presence. So one thing I want to mention before we go into our demo that Charlotte has agreed to help me with so that we could really talk about inflection. But before we go into that, I just want to mention, and we're going to talk about email and phone in just a moment, but when we're talking about verbal communications, it's so important, but sometimes that is the only thing we have to go on. So some of you are maybe have your video enabled and so you can see me, but if you don't and you're just listening to me, all you have to go on is my voice, the volume, the speed, my energy, the tone, inflection, pauses and punctuation. And so you are forming your impression of me based on my verbal communication. And so in a moment, we're going to go into nonverbal, but it's so important to make sure your communications is right on. So Charlotte, would you help me and read these statements for me? So what I've done is I've given Charlotte 3 statements to read, and to demonstrate inflection, I've asked her in each one to emphasize a particular word in that sentence. And so we'll start with the first one. Charlotte, would you mind reading that?
Sure. I didn't steal the money.
Okay. Would you say that one more time for me?
Sure. I didn't steal the money.
So if you listen to that one, I didn't steal the money, you might already be thinking, okay, Charlotte didn't steal the money, but she knows who did. All right, read the next one, please.
I didn't steal the money.
Okay, one more time.
I didn't steal the money.
Okay, so hopefully you guys are here, and she didn't steal it, but I think she thinks she borrowed it, right? So again, just based on where you put your inflection, where you put your emphasis. All right, our last statement, Charlotte.
I didn't steal the money.
Okay, one more time.
I didn't steal the money.
Okay, she didn't steal the money, but she stole something else. And so I hope that you realize just simply by emphasizing certain things based on your voice inflection, you can completely change the meaning of what you're saying. And so I think about sometimes people can be tentative or unsure, and so they might have some inflection at the end of a sentence so that it sounds like a question instead of a statement. It's all of these things that go into credible communications. All right, so I wanted to share a model with you, something that I have found really helpful. I share this with all my clients in my workshops and in my coaching, and I wanted to share it here with you today because I think it's a really good way if you are trying to speak to a large audience, if you're trying to get buy-in on a particular topic, if you're in a meeting with a few individuals, or even one-on-one. So this works for a variety of different communications. You should be answering 4 key questions, and they are the following. First, why are we having this conversation? Why are we doing this? Why is it important? Why are we here? Why are we here today? See, this explains the desired outcome. And it's so interesting that I see people in meetings and you think everybody's on the same page when they're really not. And so getting the why out and making sure everybody understands why we're here, why we're having this conversation in the first place, and ultimately what our desired outcome is, we could be more successful. Next, we start with the what. What are the facts? What do we know? What we're trying to get accomplished here is, what is the objective? What are we specifically trying to accomplish? And so if I use a real life example, maybe in a business setting, you're trying to get buy-off on releasing a new product. So you might say, we're here today to discuss why it's important for us to introduce this product. The facts are the customers are offering, the competition is offering this product to our customers. And if we don't offer something, then we're going to be sort of behind the 8 ball. And so it's really important that we do this. Here's how it's priced. Here's how it's positioned. Here's who's buying it. So that's all the facts. Then we go to the who. Who's impacted by this? Who needs to be a champion? Who could be the person who's going to buy into it? Who might be a naysayer that we need to be aware of so that we could bring them into the fold? And so in this example, if we're introducing a product, we would need to be able to communicate to the sales force, to other people in the organization about what the impact is of us releasing this, how it's going to be positioned, how it's going to be priced, etc. And then last but not least, we have the how. And the how is, how will you execute on this? How will you go about it? What are those next steps? And this is really important because this is really the wrap up for accountability and ownership. And if you look at these 4 questions, they really do kind of go in order, but you might go back and forth. You might state the why, go into the what. You might have to go back to the why just to maybe clarify something. And so while it looks sort of linear, it's actually kind of circular in nature. One other thing I want to mention on this, and again, I really like this approach, no matter what you are communicating about, whether it's in your business. I will tell you, I have people that tell me they use this with their teenagers and try it out, and it's really effective. So it can be in your personal life, part of this network of DU, the volunteer network. But whatever it is, remember that this is a great and effective approach to communications. One last point before I move on, I want to mention the how. And so it might seem strange to you that the how will we go about this, what's our plan, what are the next steps, all those how things is last, because usually we kind of walk in kind of knowing what we need to do. But the really big issue here and the challenge is, if you walked into a meeting and said, this is what we're doing, and by the way, I want to get your feedback, you probably wouldn't get really good feedback because people will say, well, you've already got it figured out. Why do you need me? So the how is at the end. It doesn't mean that you don't go in with a plan, but it means you don't share the plan until you've really set the stage for the why, the what, the who, and then you go into the how. So I'm going to move on, and I think this is a great way to sort of close out the verbal part of what we're talking about here today. And if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough, and that's Albert Einstein. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention anything about the virtual world, because that is our day-to-day. We've got everything from all kinds of social media, whether it's LinkedIn and Facebook or Instagram or whatever it is that you use. And so I just want to do a quick mention of professional presence as it relates to the virtual world. And so I know that most of you know this, but I will tell you, I deal with lots and lots of companies, and they have not hired people because of what's been on their LinkedIn or their Facebook or pictures that they posted on Instagram. And so just to be aware that that forms what your professional presence is, and to really be aware of that. And so virtual is extremely important in making up our entire presence. Remember, again, presence is about how we show up. It's really, presence when that person walks in the room. And so you don't want these other things to get in the way. Now, I have a few things on here that you might say, well, cell phone, why is that virtual? And so kind of didn't know where to put it. So it's here because I wanted to make sure we touched on it. But just how you use your cell phone. Do you take calls in a meeting? Do you put it on mute? Just all the things that are wrapped up in your cell phone. I'll never forget, I was in a meeting and somebody had kind of a funky ringtone. And I mean, everybody just stopped what they were doing and turned and looked at this person. And they were like, whoops, whoops. My daughter always sort of reprograms my cell phone and I never know what's going to play. And so while funny, we need to think of those things. If you're trying to sell a really big, good idea, these are the things that could kind of take you maybe in a different direction. Email, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on email. I simply want to mention email is a form of communication, and sometimes people can misunderstand what your email is saying. Do you have lots of caps? Do you have exclamation points, lots of smiley faces? All of those things takes away from your message and what you're trying to say. And then voicemail, kind of the same thing. And I'll never forget, I recently had a client who was in sales. And when I met them, I said to him, so tell me, how would you describe yourself if you were going to, in 3 or 4 words or phrases, describe yourself? He said, I'm friendly, I'm approachable, and I'm easy to get to know. And so I said, that's great. But, I called your voicemail before you and I met. Well, I called your number and I got your voicemail. And it seemed kind of maybe abrupt and not really very friendly and a little direct. And your voice was kind of very, very sort of strong. And so we called it together and he listened to it and he said, you know what? You're right. It sounded rushed. It sounded impatient, and it didn't sound friendly and approachable. So the message that I wanted to leave you with here is all of these things go into your professional presence. All of this makes up your presence. And again, it's all about communication and how you communicate. So let's now talk about my favorite part, which is the nonverbal. And if you remember, we talked about the nonverbal represents 55% of the way in which a message is received. And so one of my favorite things that I'll do in a workshop when I've got people in a room is I'll show a video and I'll turn down the volume and I let people see the body language and kind of then give me a sense of what they think the person is saying. And invariably, you can see that sometimes the gestures, the body language, the facial expressions don't always match what they're trying to communicate. So, and I love this quote, a gesture is understood by everyone. You need nothing else, no words. And I mean, think about this. Maybe you're in your car, you're rushing to the office, or you're rushing to a meeting, or maybe you're rushing because you have to pick kids up or something along those lines, and you cut somebody off, right? And maybe they'll beep their horn, but I bet if you turned and looked at them, you would see this definitive gesture. We're not going to go ahead and name it here, but the point is a gesture is understood by everyone. You don't need any words. And that's why nonverbal is so important. And so you see some of the faces here. And so, so we'll talk about those in a minute, but let's look at all of these elements. First and foremost, physical appearance. And I'm not here to tell you how to dress. You know what makes sense for your office environment, for the types of functions that you go to. But the point is, if we are making a first impression of you and it's formed instantaneously, one of the things that we're looking at is your physical appearance. Is your hair styled? Or you need an appearance, are you all wrinkled and things don't match, and, shirts unironed or sticking out of your pants, or, just whatever. If you look disheveled, then people are not going to have that trust factor. So physical appearance is extremely important. Next is space and distance. And I think about space and distance. First and foremost, let's talk about space and how important space is. And so when you think about how you take up your space, and not to make this into a male versus female thing, but men typically can take up more space than a woman. And I think of this way: if you're sitting in a chair, a man will typically be more sort of open. They'll have if the chair has arms, they'll have their arms on the chair. They'll be sitting open. So they're literally taking up more space, where a woman taught cross your legs, look demure. And so what happens is when we do that, we tend to fold into ourselves and we don't take up our space. And space really represents confidence and that we own our space. Next is distance. And so I'm from New York originally, and so distance, we kept our distance. You don't say hello to strangers, you stand far apart. When you go into some other countries, you find that people stand much closer to you. I'm now in Atlanta, Georgia, and people tend to close that distance a little bit. It's more friendlier, so people tend to stand closer to one another. Understand what the distance requirements are. Just be aware of this. I don't know if you've ever experienced, but I've had instances where I felt like somebody was literally in my face, and you tend to kind of walk it back a little bit. And what happens is that person loses their effectiveness when they're communicating. Next, let's talk about body language. And so there's lots that goes into body language, and I'm going to save some of this for my next slide. But ultimately, when we're talking about body language, we're talking about all kinds of things: gestures, how you hold yourself, your posture, your stance. All of those things go into body language, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. There's also hands and gestures. And so for those that can see the video, if I'm gesturing all around, it could take your mind off of what I'm actually saying because you're looking at my hands. Maybe you have some gestures or some things that you do when you speak. Maybe you twirl your hair. Maybe you have a pen in your hand and you click, off, on, and you can hear the clicking noise. What happens is those things are distracting. So to realize what are the gestures and the things that you do that can take away from your message, and to keep those in mind. Then there's facial expressions. And so you see some of those here just in these pictures. And so the first one might be somebody who's kind of maybe serious or just sort of level. The second is maybe someone who's, oh my God, is that what you mean? And a little like sort of maybe annoyed or shocked about how could you say that? Maybe a little anger kind of mixed in there. Next comes happiness. So you see smiling. Going to the bottom, somebody who's maybe a little sort of disappointed, thinking that they were going to get that big promotion and they didn't. A little surprise is the next one. And then ultimately someone who's a little sad. Maybe they got some bad news or something terrible is happening. But what I want you to notice is that just simply by our facial expressions, we are able to communicate so much. And that's what people are reading when they first meet you, as well as in lasting impressions. So really to keep those things in mind. We're going to talk about eye contact as well in just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and just talk a little bit about body language. And Amy Cuddy wrote a great article. She's got some YouTube videos. She's come out with a book called Presence. She's a Harvard psychologist. And her colleague did some research about body language. And what's fascinating about this is that your body language shapes who you are. And what she means by that, and what I want to explain here, is that we were just talking about body language and confidence and all of those things. So imagine there's a time where you're walking into a meeting and you're not feeling as confident. What Amy Cuddy and her colleagues have found is that if you stand straight up, put your shoulders back, kind of a confident stance, that will actually precipitate your mood, meaning your body language shapes how you feel about that situation, not the other way around. We think that, oh, I'm feeling pretty good about this, and so I put my shoulders back. Actually, when we're not feeling as confident, if we take a confident stance, that actually will send signals to our brain and actually help us feel more confident. So some things to think about, again, as you're looking at effective communications. Some other things as we talk about just overall body language, the way in which you hold your head can say a lot. If I raise my chin, just kind of raise it a bit, and anyone could do this in the mirror, it could come off as condescending. If I lower my chin, it could seem kind of either submissive or not feeling like I'm confident about what I'm saying. If I tilt my head, it could be tentative, or maybe I'm trying to soften the blow of something, some hard information or feedback that I need to give, or even it might show that I'm not really committed. So simply the way in which you hold your head can communicate a lot. So really being truly level-headed, meaning holding your head high and looking straight forward, is the best way to get your message across. The other thing I'd like to talk about when we think about body language is simply the way in which you stand. So I'm talking about your head, but the way in which we hold ourselves. So with our shoulders back, and if we're talking to someone, facing them, so we're really coming straight on. What we find, though, is that dominant people will lean in to express negative opinions. So they'll lean in to give tough feedback or a tough message or to show their dominance. Again, tons of different ways to show how credible communication shows up in body language. Ultimately, the thing that I think is really important is that if you mirror somebody's body language, they are more apt to buy from you. And a study was done that said 82% of people will buy from you when you match and mirror their body language. Now, I look at that buy from you as it doesn't have to be you're a salesperson and you're selling something. If you simply want to get buy-in to something, you should look at the body language of other people and match and mirror that. Now, don't go like crazy, don't go overboard. The point is that if someone is sitting back in their seat, you don't want to be sitting up in your seat and kind of in their face. Vice versa, if they're excited what you're talking about and they're sitting forward, then you might want to sit forward too. If you're sitting back, it may come off as too casual. So the matching and mirroring is ultimately showing the energy level and that you're in line and it's sort of kind of thinking in line with the individual you're communicating with. So matching body language, really important. So I said I wanted to say one more thing about hands and gestures, and I thought this was just a funny way to look at things. Of course, I remember you're the salesman with the firm handshake. And so just to realize that it's about gestures, your handshakes, it's all the things that you present that determines your credible communication. Next, let's talk a little bit about eye contact. And you can see this here. I read someplace that eye contact is a very important business skill. And if you're just listening to this and not seeing the cartoon that I have here, two people are just head to head, eye to eye, staring at each other. I get this question a lot. What makes eye contact effective? And so first is to think about that when you make eye contact as a speaker, it shows that you're in command. As a listener, it shows respect. So just simply by making eye contact can really convey just those 2 points, respect and really commanding your space and showing your confidence. The other thing I get a lot of questions about is, what if you're making a presentation to a large group? How do I make eye contact? And people have told me they've gotten ideas around you should divide the room up in threes or quarters and stare at the different parts of the room. And that's well and good if you're making really formal presentations, you can divide the room up. But I don't really recommend it, especially if you're typically making presentations to a small group, The reason being is it really looks like you're looking over people's heads, and so you're really not connecting with them, and it makes them feel uncomfortable because it's sort of like, well, what are they looking at? And again, that detracts from what you're trying to communicate. The best way to make eye contact, and this is just sort of a rule of thumb, it's only for a few seconds. So when you make eye contact, sort of my rule of thumb is when you're looking at somebody to just look at them for the amount of time it takes to notice what color their eye color is. So if you look at someone, you might say blue, and then you can move on, or green, or brown, or hazel, or whatever it is. That's about how long you should hold eye contact before moving along. So it's just a rule of thumb, but it's a few seconds before it becomes maybe sort of creepy or scary. So again, eye contact, one of the key things in being effective in getting your message across. I want to talk about listening because I think this is also really important as we're talking about nonverbal. And you may not have realized this, but the word listen contains the same letters as the word silent. So that should already give you maybe some thoughts about how important listening is. And I always say, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, so use them proportionately. So listening is so key and so important in credible communications. Let's look at just a few thoughts on listening. So first and foremost, when I talk about listening, what happens is, we think that we have to always jump in and give our point of view and share what we think. But sometimes it's better to listen and to listen to what other people have to say. And when you do that, people tend to trust you, which goes back to how our first impressions formed and how do they continue to be lasting impressions. So people trust you, and they trust you because you're listening. They feel you maybe nodding, or they see you nodding your head. They feel like you're taking it in. Maybe you're asking questions as a follow-up, but people will tend to trust you more. Next, listening helps solve problems. By just maybe simply asking one question and sitting back and listening, it can help you solve problems because people are giving you information that maybe you would not have had you just continued to speak. So it really helps solve problems. Next, it becomes reciprocal. So when you listen, it helps other people who want to listen to you. And again, what a great way to solve problems when you're listening and the other individual is listening. Next, it develops buy-in, because when you're both listening, you're hearing what the other person has to say, the trust is there, you're solving problems, it's reciprocal, and it helps develop buy-in. That's where you're an effective communicator. So listening, really key when we talk about these things. And I want to leave you with one thought, which is we listen to reply instead of listening to understand. And I'll say this one more time. We listen to reply instead of listening to understand. And what this means is that when we're in a meeting, when we're communicating with somebody, whether it's on the phone, in person, whatever it is, we're ready to just jump on in and say what's on our mind. Half the time, we're not even listening because we're just waiting for the pause of when we could jump in. And what I'm suggesting is listen to understand, not listen to reply. That's where you're going to be more effective. So I want to touch on detractors. And so I mentioned that this too is a part of professional presence. And it's really important because when we think about things that detract from our presence, it's things that we may not even think about. And so I wanted to touch on a few of these and then talk about how you could manage when you see it in others. So first and foremost, attitude. And I know that you all have seen this where maybe there's somebody who's got a positive attitude and that attitude just generates excitement and energy. That's someone you want to be around. But what's the flip side of that when it's a negative attitude? And to be aware of that, maybe it's a naysayer, somebody who's bringing kind of that negative energy, and we've all experienced it. But what happens is that detracts from your presence. And so just to be aware, what is your attitude? Is it positive or is it of the naysayer? One of the clients that I was working with said, well, you know what, that's what people like about me, that I'm the one that shoots holes in things. And is able to kind of take good ideas and make sure that there's no holes in it. But when I actually did some feedback on this individual, and I actually got 360 feedback to share with him, people said that sometimes he was too negative and it was difficult to be around him, and they hated bringing a new idea because they knew he was just going to be like a Debbie Downer. So be aware of what your attitude is when you approach things. Again, I'm looking at these unconscious behaviors, things that you can be smart, you can show up, you've done your homework, you can do all those things, but these things can detract from the way in which you communicate. Next is finding the balance between being assertive and finding your voice. I coach a lot of people, and these two things in and of themselves are the two things that I hear the most. So either my client will be too assertive and they'll say they're always jumping in, they talk over people, they don't give people an opportunity to say things. And then what happens when they leave the room, they think they've got buy-in, and they really don't, because people just sort of just let them speak, and then kind of behind the scenes is where they find out the buy-in really isn't there. So you really got to find the balance between being assertive and finding your voice. I'm coaching somebody right now. He's a vice president. He wants to be president. His manager said he's got to find his voice. He doesn't speak up enough. He just kind of sits back, lets other people speak, and he doesn't jump in and share his thoughts. That's another thing that can detract, because people feel like you're sort of just kind of in the background and you're not really have a strong opinion, and that can take away from your presence. Next is sort of the emotional. Some of us are more emotional than others. I tend to think that I bring my emotions a little bit more into things. You know when I'm happy, you know when I'm excited. And I've had to work over the years to not bring the negative emotions in. So many of us have to do that. So maybe you've met somebody, or you've worked for somebody, or maybe even you're that person who's calm under pressure. That then brings your team. It gives that calmness, and people are able to operate versus that emotional. I was coaching somebody not too long ago who was really emotional, and they'd have sort of these flare-ups. And with the people that I was doing 360 feedback with, what his team said about him was that, we have to sort of gauge, how's he feeling today? Is he in a good mood before we'll go ahead and present a good idea to him? So again, understanding your emotions and being self-aware of when they could get in the way. Next is really the next three, and I'll touch on these almost pretty much together, but being skeptical. That can shut down trust. It's great to ask questions, ask like, where'd that come from? Did you do your homework? Help me understand. But if you're too skeptical, that gets at that trust, and people won't bring new ideas to you. Inflexibility is kind of in that same line of thought. So if you're coming off as inflexible, this is how we do things, what's going to happen is that's going to shut down communication. And then defensiveness, where maybe you're taking it personally. Another thing to worry about, because once again, what happens is the conversation becomes not about what you're really talking about. It's, well, I didn't mean to offend you, or things along those lines. And it takes away from what I would call your power. And what we want to do when we're communicating is be credible, get people to trust us, and have that presence where people believe we've got the confidence and the credibility. So just a couple of things on just taking this one step further. Maybe you're in situations where other people are doing some of these things, and I wanted to just touch on these. And so just real quick, those, and there's a study done, leaders that are self-aware, 90% of leaders that are self-aware do these things. And what they do is, so if someone is negative, they're emotional, some of the things we just talked about, the first thing they do, they distance themselves and they redirect the conversation. So if it's going down a path, they redirect it and focus on something that's productive, or perhaps focus on fixing whatever needs to be fixed, whatever is broken. Next, they rise above the emotions and they stick to the facts. So if there's lots of emotion going on in the room, they try and focus on the facts. Next, They're aware of their own emotions, so they know what their triggers are, and they self-manage. And so they understand that maybe this situation or this person, or when somebody goes all emotional, it makes me feel emotional. And what they do is they manage that. They're aware of what their emotions are. So those are just some of the things in a study that was done actually by a group called Talent Smart. And it's a great article. If you Google that, you can read this as well. The last thing I wanted to share today, and I've got a couple of slides, but I just wanted to share a model that I've developed. And I'm going to show it to you, and then anyone who's interested in it, please reach out to me. I've written articles about this. I've developed this model. I can show you how to use it, and I've got lots of information on it. I'm going to put it up on the screen real quick. We're not going to go through it in great detail, but I wanted you to know that there's a tool and a resource for you. And I named the model ASK. Ask for breakthrough communication. So when you're finding one of these situations, maybe you don't see eye to eye with somebody, things are kind of going south. Maybe you're dealing with different sets of facts or information or data, or they want to do it one way and you want to do it another way. I have a simple formula called ASK that stands for acknowledge, situation analysis, and take action. And so here's the model, and I'm just going to put it on the screen for you. Again, if it's something you're interested in, please reach out to me. I'm happy to share these questions and all of this information with you. But the first step is acknowledge. And real quick, what we're trying to do here is to acknowledge feelings, to acknowledge what the person might be experiencing, and to get that out on the table. And so acknowledge, really important. Next is situation analysis. And from a situation perspective, what we want to do is understand, what is your perspective? Here's my perspective. And what we're getting at here are the facts. So perhaps in acknowledge, that's where you might say, you're feeling frustrated. Here's how I'm feeling. And so you can get the feelings out. And once the feelings are out, then you could go to, let's now solve the problem. What are the facts that you have? Here are the facts that I have. And then last but not least is our take action. And so what happens is once you've got the feelings and the facts out, then you can really work on solving the problem. And the take action is about getting ownership and accountability and being clear about who's doing what and what those next steps are. So I call it ASK, and it's Ask for Breakthrough Communications. So just real quick, the 7 habits of highly effective people. And if you're not seeing slides and just listening to the audio, I've got coffee drinking, nail biting, teeth grinding, and leg jiggling. But really, just in all seriousness now, I've got 3 tips for credible communications and professional presence. And they are everything we've talked about today. Make sure your first impressions are lasting impressions. We talked a lot about that today. Become conscious of the verbal and the nonverbal elements. Be aware of what might trigger you as far as gestures and things that you might do that might take away from your power and from your credible communications. And last but not least, identify the unconscious behaviors that can detract from your presence. So with that, and I've got another cartoon up here, professional presence. And it's really about success. We're talking about how to be successful in communicating. And so the cartoon here is actually success is 2% inspiration, 97% perspiration, and 1% deodorant. And with that, I want to take you to an execution plan. We all listen to different webinars, we go to seminars, we go to different educational things. What I want you to do is to put the things that we talked about today in practice. And so this is just a simple format. And again, if you reach out to me, I'm happy to share this with you. But first and foremost, what's your goal? What will you do? And so I've got some examples up here. I want to ensure my verbal and nonverbal are consistent. I want to be more conscious of my impression, my first impressions that I make and how those translate to lasting impressions. I want to understand the impact of communication style. of my communication style. And last but not least, I want to identify the behaviors that detract from my presence. Now, these may not be your goals. I just kind of put them up there to give you some ideas. So from today, what steps will you take? What are the 1, 2, or 3 things that you would like to do? And then what are the key actions? So let's just say you want to be more conscious of your first impressions and be more aware of how you show up when you're meeting people or when you're on the phone, knowing that they're just hearing your voice. So what steps can you take? So one thing that I do when I'm on the phone, I tend to stand because that raises energy and it helps you with just getting your voice to really inflect and getting it out there, and it's usually stronger. What are your desired incomes? What's important about this? What do you want to gain? Maybe you want people to see you as a bit more powerful, more credible. And then I'm always big on when are you going to do this? When are you going to start it? And when are you going to finish it? So with that, that is my recommended execution plan for today. Take a moment. What are the 2 or 3 things that you would like to do or do differently as a result of today? And put your action plan together. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, your energy, for listening in. And now I know we have just a few more minutes. I'd love to take some questions, and I'll turn this over to the Denver University folks who could help moderate our questions.
Okay, so if any of you guys have questions, you can put them in the chat, and we can ask them on your behalf.
And just again, I wanted to say, if there's anything that you heard about today that you would like some additional information on, you see my information here, please email me at shamel@thesagealliance.com. You can visit my website, thesagealliance.com. I've got lots of leadership articles and things posted, or call me. I'm happy to speak with any of you. You're part of DU, and if there's anything I could do to help you, I'd be happy to speak with you. So Charlotte, any questions? Or do we have a quiet group today?
Looks, well, maybe you answered all of their questions with your amazing presentation. Oh, I think we have a question coming in. Hang on.
I will tell you one question that people that I tend to get about communications is what if I need to sort of reposition the way that I've been communicating? So maybe I've been doing some of these either detractors, or I haven't been aware of my emotions. How do I go about changing that? And really, it starts the moment that you start communicating differently. And so what I usually do with my clients, my coaching clients, I'll ask them from a self-awareness perspective to either write something down or to track how often they do something. So let's say you want to take emotion out of the way in which that you speak, or when you're interacting with somebody and you get tense or emotional about something. And so what you can do is you can track it. And so how many times are you being emotional, and track it over the course of a day, a week, a month. And then whatever works for you, tie a string to your finger, put something on your calendar at the start of every day. I'm not going to be emotional. Write a sticky, whatever your system is, and then start tracking the times that you aren't emotional, and compare and contrast. And even if you start to get emotional and you catch yourself, that's just a win right there. So that's something that a lot of people ask, just how do I go about maybe changing something that maybe I've noticed I don't like in my communication.
All right, so I have our question.
Charlotte, any more?
If you're ready.
Yeah.
So someone wanted to say that they have a client who gets really wound up and they start to worry about this person. So they're wondering if you have any suggestions on how to calm other people down or to help them manage their emotions in a professional environment.
Yeah, and it's really the things that we talked about. It's when I was talking about the 90% of people that, of top leaders that, they redirect, they do all of those things that we talked about, that can help. But if your client is ultimately emotional, I really suggest that you use the ask model that I shared with you. And whoever that is, go ahead, send me an email, reach out. I'll send you the article, the model, all the information. I have a client that I'm working with, and she has a very difficult client, and she used Ask, and she was shocked at how well it worked. The first step is acknowledging how they're feeling. And by the way, when you acknowledge, it doesn't mean you're saying, oh, you're right and I'm wrong. It doesn't mean anything like that. It's just you're acknowledging that they're upset, or they're frustrated, or that they're worrying, or whatever their emotion is. And you're letting them know that you're listening. And then you can say, okay, I see that you're upset. I see that you're worried. Let's talk about what are some of the things that would make you feel more comfortable here. And then you could get into the facts and the problem solving. And once again, I'm happy to share that model with anyone. Any other questions from our listeners?
I don't see anything right now, but we could give it another few seconds if you want.
Okay. I think the biggest thing, and this is something else that I hear a lot, is usually when I present this in a large setting, most people don't realize the nonverbal communications. And so I would love for everybody who's listening in here today to pick something that they do on the nonverbal side. Maybe you cross your arms, maybe you do something, your stands, maybe you don't make good eye contact. Whatever it is, pick something that will help you be more effective. And then the other area where I usually get lots of questions is about the listening, and the listening to respond instead of listening to understand. And so I want to challenge each and every one of you to and do whatever works for you, but literally sit on your hands the next time you're in a meeting with your customer, on a phone call, whatever it is. And when somebody says something and you're just ready to jump in, that you're actually going to pause and then speak. And I promise you, when you do that pause, you're actually going to be taking in more information, and you're not thinking about formulating what your answer is. So any more questions before we wrap up?
I think that's it.
Well, thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley. Thank you so much. And we will be sure to get this presentation out to everyone who we were marketing this to. So we can also forward on any questions that we receive on our end as well.
Yes, please do. I'm happy to speak to anybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.